Story 1. I saw myself in the mirror as I adjusted my tie, choosing the final touches to my appearance. The suit fit perfectly, but I knew that behind the outward order, there was something far more complex. This was the last evening, the last time I sat with her, the last time we both tried to fake something we once called a relationship. It was all made up, made to seem right and perfect. But I felt like behind every look, behind every movement, something painful was hiding. We were on the verge of shattering all illusions. Grace and I were connected for what could be called lost years. I once looked to our union for support, security, and stability, and she, it seemed, was looking for the same. We both thought we had found each other at the right time, but time passed and everything changed. Everything became empty. And when I looked at our future, I couldn't understand what I was looking for there. I kept moving forward, despite the fact that part of me had long wanted to stop. Every day with Grace seemed like a routine process, where everything went according to plan, where there was no room for change. We were both so used to it that we almost didn't notice how everything was disappearing. And the moment I first felt the emptiness, I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to stop it. And now, standing in front of the mirror, getting ready for my last dinner, I understood that this emptiness would not go away anyway. The day we decided to end it wasn't as painful as I expected. It came more as a logical conclusion to something we'd both known for a long time. But even so, there was something unpleasant in the realization that our union hadn't been real. It had been an attempt to fill a void, but in reality, we were both just playing roles. And here I was again, faced with this decision. We had to end this process with dignity. We knew that divorce was inevitable, but we couldn't quite believe that now, after all these years, we wouldn't even have something important to say to each other. Something truly sincere. Tracy called me this morning. I knew she was worried, and although her words were supportive, I could sense the underlying worry in her voice. She was worried. She was expecting a baby, and despite my tiredness and inner tension, I had promised her that everything would be okay. But there was something in the way she said those words that made me think. I kissed her belly and told her I would do everything to keep her and our baby safe, and left, although I couldn't shake the feeling that I was leaving one of the most important moments of my life. The restaurant I came to was the same one we had been to many times. The familiar interior with its dim lighting and serious atmosphere seemed alien now. There was none of the excitement I once felt whenever she appeared. This place had become a symbol of our soulless routine, but I knew that today would be different. She had to say something, change something, but I didn't yet understand what it was. When I walked in, I saw her right away. Grace was sitting at the table, looking straight ahead, as if she was expecting something. Her posture was familiar, a little wary, but still calm. She looked the same as when I fell in love with her, and yet, despite her appearance, I felt the tension between us growing. Our story was about to end, and it was no longer just a breakup. It was something more. I sat down opposite her. Everything seemed so familiar, but different. At the table, we were just actors who had been playing the same role for a long time, and I knew that she was not going to leave the stage so easily. I tried to remain calm, but there was something new in her gaze, something unsettling, something I could not ignore. I realized that this evening was not just a dinner. It was a farewell, not just to her, but to myself. I was saying goodbye to a way of life that no longer made sense. I was saying goodbye to the illusions that had once filled my existence. I knew that leaving would be hard, but perhaps it was the only right step. As soon as I sat down at the table, she looked at me as if she expected something, but I could no longer understand what exactly. All I saw in her eyes was uncertainty, mixed with something more than just a question. Her calm, her usual confidence. It was like a trap that I could have fallen into if I had not realized that this moment was different from all the others. We sat in silence, and this silence was much louder than any words. I knew that another step into the unknown lay ahead, but whatever it was, I was ready. That evening, as I left the restaurant, the world around me seemed different than I knew it. Everything was familiar, but distant, as if I were looking at my life through a glass that was clouded. I walked down the street, lost in thought, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The traffic was humming nearby, the sky was overcast, and the rain that had begun to fall seemed to underscore the atmosphere of what was happening. I felt that something inevitable had ended, but I still didn't know what it would mean for me. At home in the empty apartment, where every corner was familiar, I could still feel her presence. Grace had left a part of herself here, pieces of memory, simple things that seemed part of everyday life, but now carried the weight of not being together. I took off my suit, threw it on the bed, and went to the window. The outside world seemed cold and uninviting, and I felt like nothing would ever be the same again. The feeling of emptiness never left me. Grace, despite her calm at the table, was the person I spent almost my entire adult life with. We both grew up together, albeit in different ways. I was perhaps too fixated on the idea of stability, and maybe that was why she was there. She was part of this false world we had built over the years. I would look at the photographs on the shelf and see us both, young and happy. It had all seemed real then, but over time those moments had faded, as if we were simply frozen in the past, unable to move on. I suddenly realized that the life I had once dreamed of building with Grace had long since ceased to exist. We had both been moving by inertia, not noticing how everything around us was changing, until one day there came a moment when it was too late to change anything. My head was full of doubts. Was this the right decision? Was there really no way to get back something of what we had lost? But there were no answers to these questions. I knew that despite all this, I couldn't continue to live in illusions. Grace and I were simply not happy. The weight of the decision I had made was still on me. I tried to find solace in ordinary things, but nothing worked. Every sound in the apartment, every glance at the empty chair, at her things, everything reminded me of what I had lost. And at the same time, I felt a strange relief. Perhaps this was the first step towards freedom. The next morning, when I found myself back in this world, I knew it was time to move on. But no matter how hard I tried, thoughts of Grace and what we had been through together would not leave me. We would be happy if we could fix everything. But it was clear to me, we could not. Nothing from the past would return. I met with Tracy, as promised. She was the only one who could understand how I felt. She was always there, and now I needed to open my heart to her. We met in the park, and I noticed how she looked at me with concern, as if she felt that something was wrong. There was the same worry in her eyes as yesterday when she called, and I realized that I could not hide from her for long what was happening. I was ready to share everything, but I needed time to process it myself. The weather was changing again. The clouds that loomed on the horizon reminded me of my own internal struggle. I was worried not only about the end of my relationship with Grace, but also about the uncertainty ahead. Unclear about where I was going, what would happen next. The idea that I had once been part of something bigger, that I had the opportunity to make things right, haunted me. Tracy didn't ask about Grace right away. She waited for me to talk, for me to open up about my feelings. I told her about how it had all started to escalate, how Grace and I had tried to get back what was gone. I talked about our ending, about how difficult it had been to make a decision. And in that moment, with her support, I began to realize that maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. But there were other feelings too, shadows of the past that wouldn't go away. Tracy didn't judge me, but her gaze was as penetrating as ever. She was the one who could see more than I could, and at some point, I felt like it was time to take the final step. I was ready to move on, but that didn't mean I'd forget what had happened. My experiences, my memories, all of it was a part of me. But maybe only by letting go of the past could I find something new. I didn't know what, but I knew I didn't want to be who I was before. And maybe that was the beginning I was looking for. A few weeks passed, and although time had not healed all my wounds, I felt like I had already begun to adapt to the new reality. My life, which had seemed gray and monotonous after the breakup with Grace, was suddenly filled with new shades. And although I still did not know how to move on, although each day was still as difficult, I felt like I was finding a way to myself, to the version of me that was hidden behind all this concern for stability and perfection. I spent a lot of time alone with myself, thinking about how to get to the point where I was now. There was no clear plan or goal. There was just a feeling that I needed to move forward without looking back and be ready to accept everything that was ahead. I allowed myself to not think about what I expected from life. It was a liberating feeling. I no longer strived for perfection. I stopped looking for answers where there were none. My encounter with Tracy in the park, brief as it was, left its mark. She didn't push her advice on me or try to fix me. She was just there. I knew we didn't have the same deep connection as Grace, but there was something comforting about her presence. It was like meeting someone who saw right through you and yet didn't judge you. But I also knew that Tracy wasn't the answer to my problems. She was a support along the way, not an endpoint. Every time I stepped outside, the city that had seemed so monotonous to me now looked like a huge canvas on which I could write my new story. And it was in those moments that I began to wonder what would happen next. How long would it take me to feel like everything I had been through was not in vain? How long would it take me to realize that I could actually move forward and not just run in circles, hoping for something that was already gone? My view on relationships has changed. I realized that all my attempts to find the right model, to build an ideal relationship, were a mistake. There are no ready-made solutions in life, no scenarios that would definitely work. We all learn, make mistakes, but the main thing is the ability to look at things with an open mind, without getting stuck in old mistakes and predictable patterns. One evening, as I was returning from work, I was caught in the same rain as on the day of the breakup. I was standing under the roof of a small cafe, waiting for the downpour to subside. Suddenly, I noticed a familiar face outside the window, a woman I once knew. Her gaze was as calm as always, but there was something new in her eyes, something different that I couldn't understand. It was Laura, a former colleague with whom I once worked in the office. We hadn't spoken since I changed jobs, and at that moment I couldn't remember what exactly led to our paths diverging. Laura noticed me and her face lit up. She came over and invited me to sit down next to her. We started talking, at first about small things, but soon I realized that she felt the same as I did, a kind of emptiness. Everything was not as it had been before, and perhaps it was not even worth returning to that past. But there was sincerity in her words that made me think. She was talking about how, despite all the difficulties, she had managed to find her way, albeit a long one. And there was no pity in her words. It was as if she understood that I was in the same search, in the same process. Then I felt that perhaps I did not need to fight the past anymore. All these meetings, all these people were part of the path I was choosing. But the most important thing was that I could now be honest with myself. I no longer looked for answers in other people, did not try to find the moment when everything should change. I began to realize that if I followed my own path, without trying to force other people's ideals on myself, I could truly live. The conversation with Laura went on for a long time, and when we said goodbye, I felt not emptiness, but some kind of lightness, as if I had torn a heavy burden off myself. Maybe this is the point, not to hide from your pain or conceal it, but to learn to live with it. And I felt that this was the beginning of a new stage. I was not sure that I would be happy in the future, but at least I understood that this was my path. With each passing day, more and more things fell into place. I was not looking for a miracle, but I felt that this was the real miracle. The ability to move forward without looking back, and perhaps at some point, to find my true self. It had been a few weeks since I had first felt the change. I was beginning to realize that time doesn't heal, but it does allow me to see things from a different perspective. I still didn't know what to do with myself, but now I had far fewer questions and far more willingness to face the answers when they came. Deep down, I knew I needed more than just surviving this new reality. I needed something more, something to give these days meaning. One evening, while walking through the park, I noticed an old acquaintance. She was standing by a bench, a little apart from the rest of the people, as if she was waiting. I couldn't immediately remember her name, but the feeling that I had seen her somewhere before was too strong to ignore. She was a woman I had once accidentally crossed paths with in a cafe. We hadn't spoken to each other for more than a few sentences, but something in her gaze seemed familiar. I approached her, and she recognized me immediately. Her face didn't express surprise, as if she had been waiting for this meeting. We began to talk about simple things, as if we were casual acquaintances, but there was some strange defiance in her words, as if she knew something that I didn't. We discussed some unimportant topics, the weather, her job, my changes in life, but the conversation couldn't seem to stay on that level. "Do you come here often?" she asked, looking into my eyes as if she was trying to find out something more. "Not really," I said, a little nervous, though I didn't know why. I wasn't prepared for this conversation to veer into entirely different territory. She smiled and there was a flaw in her gaze, a shadow that slid across her eyes, but she quickly covered it up. Sometimes you just have to stop, take a walk, see the world in a new way. We continued talking, but the words she spoke were like an invisible net that grew tighter. I felt her words touching the most hidden corners of my mind, as if she were touching on topics I didn't want to reveal myself. As time went on, the conversation became more personal, and I began to feel a strange tension. She didn't ask me direct questions, but her phrases were like piercing arrows aimed at my inner world. Every look, every word she said was aimed at revealing something hidden, and I began to understand that this woman had not appeared on my path by chance. Do you know that we are always looking for something that eludes us? But in fact, it is always close by, inside us, she said, her voice becoming quieter, as if she had said something she shouldn't have. I was silent, and although her words seemed empty, they actually resonated inside. I still didn't know who she was to me or what she wanted, but something in her presence made me feel like I was faced with a choice again. As we said goodbye, I noticed how her eyes lit up, as if she knew something that was completely invisible to me. From that moment on, her figure remained in my mind, like a shadow that never left me. The woman's appearance was another reminder that I wasn't ready for my transformation to be complete. She forced me to look at things I had long tried to ignore. Perhaps she was just a mirror, showing me what I had been hiding from myself. But her presence left me with a strange feeling, as if this meeting had not been a coincidence. That evening when I returned home, I began to ponder what she had said. Why did her words resonate so strongly within me? Why did I feel that this meeting was not just a coincidence? I didn't know the answer, but I knew that the shadow that slid across her gaze was part of what I was to understand. Every day I began to perceive this world as a huge canvas on which events take place that may be important or not at all. But perhaps this meeting was the very moment I had been waiting for, not knowing what exactly it would reveal to me. With each step I took, I realized that the answers did not come as quickly as I expected. But maybe I did not need them right away. Sometimes it is enough to simply be in the moment and wait for the shadow of the past to dissolve in the light of the future. But who was this woman? Why did she come into my life now? These questions remained unanswered, but I knew that one day it would all make sense. Every day I felt more and more how the world around me was changing. These were not the changes I dreamed of, but they were what they should have been. And at some point I began to understand that perhaps everything that was happening was not an accident. Even those strangest events that seemed absurd to me had their hidden meaning. I just couldn't see it right away. One night I was awakened by a strange noise. It was something like a quiet but persistent barking. Harley usually slept peacefully, but at that moment she was alert. I didn't know what was going on, but I felt inside that something was wrong. I got out of bed, peering into the darkness, but I saw nothing. Only the silence of the night and the faint light from the window, which barely illuminated the room. Harley stood up, stretched, and headed for the door. She stopped there, as if she was expecting something, and at that moment I realized it was that same bark. Only it was not Harley. I felt it in every hair on my skin. It was something else pretending to be her voice. A second, and I found myself at the door, although I did not know what to do. I opened it. The hallway was pitch dark, almost absolute, and only a weak light from the street lamp seeped through the windows. I called Harley, but there was no answer. My heart was pounding in my chest. She usually never ran away, would not stay in such silence. I stepped into the hallway, listening for any sound, but there was nothing but a slight rustling in the basement. My hand reached for the wall, and I turned on the light. I turned around but didn't see her, and then I felt a chill run through me, like I was in a void. Harley wasn't there. My breathing quickened, and I ran down the stairs. The faster I moved, the stronger that strange itch in my head became. Something was wrong. The barking continued, but now it sounded far away, not where I expected it to be. When I opened the door to the basement, I felt the air in the room turn cold. I stood there listening, and suddenly I heard the same sound again. Barking. But it wasn't Harley. It was coming from the basement itself. I took a step forward, but the feeling of anxiety was so strong that I could hardly move. A shadow in the corner of the basement caught my attention. I couldn't see it exactly, but I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I took a step closer, and the shadow disappeared so quickly that I didn't have time to realize what it was. Harley, where was she? Why wasn't she here? Fear and uncertainty washed over me, and I screamed her name again. The barking came back, much louder now, but it wasn't getting any closer. It was close and distant at the same time, like the shadow was following me. I stood in the basement, unsure of what to do, when the sound emerged from the darkness again, a barking that was beginning to become more than a whisper. I went back upstairs, but my mind was racing. I needed to figure out what was happening. Where was Harley? Back in the room, I turned on all the lights, but everything was silent and empty. I looked again at the door that led to the street, the endless darkness outside the window. Everything looked like the world had simply stopped. I realized that I couldn't just sit in this house and wait anymore. I knew I had to do something. I had to find her, and find who or what was this creature that was leaving these traces in my world. Grabbing a flashlight, I headed toward the forest. It was late, but I couldn't wait any longer. I didn't know what was waiting for me, but it was all connected to Harley and to what I felt in my mind, that what was happening was part of something much bigger than just an accident. The forest was silent, but my footsteps echoed through the trees. The barking became weaker, but that did not comfort me. Suddenly, I noticed her. Harley stood in the center of the clearing, motionless, staring into the darkness. She did not move. I ran up, looking around anxiously, but did not notice anything unusual. As I approached her, her eyes met mine, and in that moment I realized that what I was looking for was in front of me. Creatures that could take her form, and the shadow that was now my pursuer. Morning came silently, as if nothing had happened during the night. The forest was still shrouded in fog, and there was a strange, undefined stillness in the air, as if all living things were holding their breath, not daring to move. I stood in the center of the clearing, looking at Harley, who had not moved. Her gaze was empty, as if her soul was somewhere far away, and she could not return. I knew something was wrong, but I did not know what. Harley was not simply wary, she was an ominous shadow of herself. I approached her slowly, trying to look into her eyes to find some trace of life, something familiar that would help me understand what was happening. But her gaze was cold, empty, and completely inhuman. This was not my Harley. This was something else. My heart began to pound in my chest, and I felt sweat begin to gather on my forehead. I whispered her name softly, but there was no response. All I heard was the soft whisper of the wind and the light rustling of leaves. I shook her shoulder, but her body remained hard as stone. She did not move, did not respond to me. Something inside me cracked. That moment, that look, was something terrible, something that was much deeper and more dangerous than I could have imagined. I stepped back, thoughts racing through my head. This couldn't be a coincidence. That barking last night, her strange behavior, none of it could be a simple misunderstanding. I thought about the night I heard the barking, and how it had been strangely overshadowed by what had happened to Harley. It felt like I just opened the door to something much darker and more dangerous than I could comprehend. The sight of her standing body made me feel uneasy. Was I wrong? Should I just calm down and wait for her to start acting normal again? But there was a voice inside me that wouldn't stay silent any longer. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't the normal state of an animal. I knew it. Desperately, I turned and walked back into the house, pushing away the thoughts that were building in my head. I opened the door, but in that moment, it became even clearer to me that there was more to me than just the oddities. Back in the house, I walked over to the window and looked out into the darkness, which seemed even more ominous at this point. I sat down in the chair, feeling questions growing in my head. Why was Harley so strange? Why couldn't I figure out what was happening to her? What was this creature? What was it doing? And why? And most importantly, why was it pretending to be her? None of this was a coincidence. No, this was more than just a misunderstanding or an oddity. It was part of something I couldn't understand, but couldn't ignore. It suddenly occurred to me that I had to find answers, to the point where I couldn't stay in this house any longer, not knowing what was happening or what it could be. The realization that everything I knew was just the tip of the iceberg made me feel the full weight of what was happening. I was trapped, and if I didn't start looking for answers, if I didn't follow the trail of these strange events, I could lose control over everything that was happening around me. I stood up and looked back at the field where Harley still stood motionless. I knew I had to act. I had to go back out there, into the forest, and find what lurked in its depths. Maybe I could find out what lurked in the shadows and what had really happened to Harley, but I knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed to find someone who knew how to deal with this. Someone who understood what was happening to this world, to this forest, to these creatures. I grabbed my bag, rubbed my temples, and opened the door, ready to take on even more danger. There was only one question running through my head. What was this shadow stalking me? And how could I escape this trap before it consumed everything I had ever known? Story 2. The night Jason stayed over, everything seemed normal. We always spent our nights playing video games, talking about life and swiping pizza, so this night was no exception. We laughed, we argued, and time flew by. But as always happens, I accidentally fell asleep in the middle of one of the games. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, because when I opened my eyes, it was well after midnight. I woke up on my bed, with my headphones in and my phone somehow in my hands. Jason was gone. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. He must have gone home. After all, it was late at night, and we both had school the next morning. We always did that. When I needed to sleep, he would go away, and I would be alone. And the next morning, I would meet him in class as if nothing had happened. I checked my phone. There were no messages from him, and that seemed normal too. But just when I thought he just didn't bother me, I was overcome by a strange feeling. Something elusive that made me feel uncomfortable. In the morning when I came to school, I saw Jason. He was standing at his usual spot near the cafeteria, talking to someone, and I approached him as usual. However, the closer I got, the stronger the feeling that something was wrong. He was standing there as usual in his hoodie and jeans, but something was wrong in his eyes. I couldn't put my finger on it, but everything inside me tensed up. When we met, he turned to me and smiled. The smile was the same as always, but its rhythm, its width, everything was a little off. I tried to ignore these thoughts. Maybe it was just my worries after the night, but the feeling of unease did not leave me. We went to classes, and I noticed that something in his behavior did not match. Jason had been my friend since first grade, and I knew him like the back of my hand. His behavior, his way of speaking, even his habits, all of it was painfully familiar to me. But today it all seemed slightly different. In math class, he suddenly started using strange words. I remember how we always laughed at our teacher, calling her professor, although everyone knew that she was more like a grandmother. Jason always laughed with us, but today he called her professor, and it confused me. It was not like usual. I couldn't understand why he said that. We always joked about it, and you would think it should be funny. But there was no usual ease in his words that we always had with him. Later in gym class, things got even weirder. We always joked that Jason couldn't run, and in fact, he was the slowest runner in our class. We even called him Baby Giraffe because his movements were so awkward. But today, everything was different. He ran so fast, it was like he was someone else. I saw his face, and he wasn't out of breath or that usual awkwardness. It was like he was flying, and everything around me froze for a moment. It was one of those situations where you see something familiar, but it suddenly changes to such an extent that you start to doubt your own reality. I tried to pull my thoughts back into place, trying to focus on what was happening around me, but I couldn't. When Jason came back to us after warming up, I noticed that his eyes, they weren't like they used to be. He'd always had green eyes. I remembered him complaining to me as a kid that he wished he had blue eyes like his dad. He often joked about it, but I knew his eyes were always green, and I had never seen him change the color of his eyes. However, today his eyes were bright blue like the sky. It was so strange that I couldn't help but ask a question. I stood next to him, trying to find a reason to talk, and I couldn't help myself. I told him that he probably wore contacts. At that moment, his gaze became slightly wary, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. He slowed his movements as if he was trying to hide something important. He simply laughed, but this laugh was not quite his. It sounded familiar but with some kind of tension, as if someone was trying to fake his laugh but failed. It was so strange that anxiety gripped me. I stood next to him and tried to talk. I couldn't understand why I had this strange certainty that something was wrong with him. I just stood there and watched him continue talking, his face so familiar, but everything about him was a little distorted. Questions started piling up, but I couldn't formulate them properly. Why had his eyes suddenly turned blue? Why had his behavior changed? And why couldn't I remember when exactly it had happened? As soon as school was over, I hurried home to figure out what was going on. I started going over everything that had happened in my head, and this strange feeling only grew stronger. I was sure that something had changed, but I couldn't figure out what it was. This wasn't my Jason. He had become someone else, and maybe he himself knew it. All morning at school, I had a strange feeling. It was like I couldn't shake the idea that something was wrong with Jason. I tried to control myself, but every detail, every little thing about his behavior was bothering me. My thoughts were fluttering in a restless circle, like birds trapped in a cage. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. At recess, I met him in the school hallway. He was standing talking to someone, and I walked up to him, smiling as always. But something was wrong again. He had the same expression on his face, the same familiar gesture. But when I looked into his eyes, I was overcome with a feeling of alienation again. Those blue eyes. Everything reminded me of Jason, but not quite. It was as if everything was in the right place, but slightly bent, like in a poorly fitted frame. I noticed that he wasn't looking at me the same way he used to. Usually, if I made a joke or said something weird, he'd laugh, or at least smile, play along. But today his face was stony. I said something automatically, a regular joke, and he just nodded, like he didn't understand what I wanted to say. He wasn't laughing. He didn't look at me like he used to, with that sincere smile that made him so special. His eyes were cold as ice. The bell rang for the next period, and we went to class. I noticed how Jason moved down the hall. He was precise, confident, like a man who always knew what he was doing. There was nothing surprising about it after all. I'd known him for a long time. But today, the way he moved was special. He wasn't just walking in the direction he needed to go. He walked as if his steps were calculated in advance and his thoughts were planned. As we sat down in class, I began to notice his mannerisms. He wrote on the board faster than usual, as if he didn't have to think about what he was writing. His hands moved smoothly, confidently, as if he were an expert who had no doubt about his actions. And when I asked him about his homework, he didn't even look up, speaking quickly and clearly, without hesitation, as if the question was too simple for him. This wasn't like the Jason I knew. He was always a little absent-minded, always pausing to answer, as if remembering something. But today, he was different. During a break between classes, when I was trying to collect my thoughts, I noticed the way he was looking at me. Not just looking, like he usually did. It was like he was fixating on me. Those blue eyes were watching me with such intensity that I felt uncomfortable. When I turned around, he was always a little late, as if he wanted me to notice his presence. I began to feel like he was watching me, as if he was expecting something. I tried to ignore it, but the inner discomfort wouldn't leave me. During my lunch break, I couldn't resist testing my thoughts. I decided to look at some old photos of Jason that I had saved on my phone. We used to look at them when we were kids, laughing at how much we'd changed over the years. I scrolled back through the photos and saw him, green-eyed as always. I remembered him complaining about wishing he had blue eyes like his dad, and how he'd often joked about it. But now as I looked at those photos, I suddenly felt my doubts become reality. In every single one of them, his eyes were green, and that didn't fit with what I'd seen today. My anxiety increased and I decided to text his mom. It was spontaneous, more of a joke than anything serious. I wrote, "Haha, Jason finally got those blue contacts, huh?" But her response was immediate and stunning. "What?" Jason has always had blue eyes. I felt a chill run down my spine. My gaze darted to the screen of my phone, and I realized that my own memories were starting to fail me. Was I wrong? Or was this all true? After that, I couldn't stay calm. My thoughts were spinning around this unresolved puzzle. I looked at Jason, and something about him was alien, unnatural now. In his behavior, his gaze, in his reaction to my words. He continued to watch me, and with each glance, this feeling only intensified. I couldn't explain it, but I felt that he was aware of what I suspected, and something in his behavior told me that he knew that I knew. It became even more frightening than I could have imagined. When the day finally came to an end and I was climbing into my locker, I ran into him again. He was standing by the door, his eyes on me. I nodded at him, but my hands were shaking. I could feel him watching my every move, like he was sure I was going to figure something out soon. And just as I was about to leave, he smiled. But it wasn't his usual warm smile. It was a strange, slow smile with some kind of artificial expression. I felt the blood drain from my face, and I knew it wasn't Jason. It was something else. He said, "I'll see you later," but his voice sounded too distant. I turned around to leave, and I noticed him standing there, not moving, not turning away, just watching me. In that moment, I knew for sure something was up, and it wasn't my best friend. With each passing hour, it became increasingly difficult to find answers to my questions. I tried to act as normal, but my inner turmoil would not leave me. When I tried to talk to Jason, his words and mannerisms, which seemed normal, actually left me in a state of confusion. I kept replaying my memories in my head, as if searching for a clue in them. But every time I came across an answer, something new would disrupt the picture. A few days later, when I saw Jason at school, he continued to act strangely. There were no significant changes in his appearance, except for his eyes. He was as usual, in his usual clothes, with the same mannerisms that I knew from childhood. However, every time his gaze met mine, I felt that something was wrong. We stood opposite each other, but it was as if there was an invisible wall between us. I began to suspect that perhaps Jason had not been replaced, but that something had happened to him. Maybe he had experienced some kind of shock that changed his behavior. Or maybe it was just my brain making up all these strange things because I was too worried about his eyes. I tried to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, but the feeling did not go away. At some point, I decided that I needed to talk to him frankly. I wasn't ready to sit and watch everything change around me. I realized that I needed to figure out what was going on, and if something was wrong with him, I needed to help. However, as soon as I approached him, I felt a strange detachment. His behavior was the same as always, but some invisible barrier, like a shadow, separated us. I tried to start a conversation, but he treated it somehow detached, as if he didn't care. His answers were short and emotionless, and at some point I noticed how his gaze was frozen again, as if he didn't really see me. "Are you okay?" I asked, but the answer was instant and cold as ice. He said something like, "Yeah, everything is fine," but I couldn't shake the thought that it was something more than just a lack of interest. I looked into his eyes and realized that they were now hardly human. They were empty, lifeless. I felt that his gaze was no longer the same as before. My anxiety reached a new level. I began to look for answers in all sorts of places, including old notes, photos, and even moments that we shared together. I reread hundreds of messages we exchanged, our conversations in the old group, our jokes, even those funny moments when he said something ridiculous. All of these notes now seemed alien, as if these words were not written by Jason. And the strangest thing was that in all of his photos, starting from the earliest ones, his eyes were still green, as always. I wrote to his mother again. I could not remain silent any longer. I needed to at least ease my anxiety a little. And although I did not expect a serious answer, deep down I still hoped that I was wrong. But the answer I received only worsened my condition. "Yes, Jason has always had blue eyes." This message was like a punch in the face. I did not know what to think. The day passed and my worries continued. I had trouble concentrating in class, and even during breaks I kept looking around, trying to catch Jason's eye. When I tried to talk to him, it all came down to the fact that he looked like him, but he wasn't him. I couldn't figure out what to do with this feeling that the person I knew no longer existed. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed and tried to analyze everything that had happened. I remembered the moment Jason first said he wanted blue eyes and how we laughed about it. I suddenly realized that it wasn't just a joke. Maybe he himself didn't realize how much he wanted to be someone else, someone no one would recognize. Maybe his consciousness had changed and now he was trying to hide it. Maybe someone or something could interfere with his life so much that he lost his essence. Or maybe this was just a nightmare that I couldn't get out of. When the morning came, I saw Jason again. He was walking down the hallway, and his eyes were blue as always. I felt that strange feeling again, as if I was on the verge of something important. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing. I had to find out the truth. I couldn't afford to remain in ignorance, as if this was normal. But how could I do that? How could I find answers when Jason himself might no longer know who he really was? The next day, when I saw Jason in the hallway, I was even more alarmed. He looked exactly the same as always, but I knew something was different about him. The way he walked, the way he spoke, it was all so familiar that I could hardly believe what was happening. However, the more I tried to convince myself that he was simply going through a difficult time, the more doubts crept into my soul. That day in class, I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts kept returning to Jason, his eyes, his strange behavior. I began to avoid him, not knowing how to act around this alien person he had become. Every time I saw him, I felt like he was watching me. His gaze was insistent, as if he was trying to look into my soul, to understand what I was thinking. This was not normal, and the more I tried to ignore him, the more I felt like he knew exactly what I was noticing. Lunch in the cafeteria was a real challenge. Jason sat at the same table where we usually sat, but something was wrong. His conversations were mechanical, as if he was reciting standard phrases that someone had once prompted him. He smiled, but this smile was alien, unnatural, as if he had learned it from a picture. This was not the Jason I knew. I tried to look normal, but I could not help but look at his face and try to figure out what was wrong with him. When he raised his head and met my gaze, I felt a chill down my spine. There was something frightening in his eyes. They were no longer alive. I could not describe it exactly, but it was something that went beyond the usual changes. He looked at me with such coldness, as if I were nothing more than a dot on a screen to him. I did not know what to do, and it suddenly became clear to me that this was not just strange behavior. He was sort of replaced, but not physically. Something happened inside him, and it wasn't just a random change. After school, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I had to find out the truth, not rely on guesswork and my fears. I remembered an old blog post Jason had once written when we were kids. It was some kind of childhood fantasy about how his life might have been different if he had been someone else. We laughed at it like it was an innocent joke. But now, looking back, I began to see that this idea might have been important. Maybe he had always been trying to be someone else, and now it had become reality. I couldn't ignore it, so that evening, on my way home, I decided to go to the same park where Jason and I often walked. He had always loved to spend time in this place, a strange place with long, abandoned benches and trees that seemed almost alive. I didn't know what to look for, but I felt that this was where I might find some kind of explanation. When I arrived at the place, the night had already begun to thicken, and the park was filled with darkness. The light of the street lamps barely made its way through the foliage of the trees. I walked along the usual paths, trying to collect my thoughts. But suddenly I noticed him. Jason. He was standing by an old tree, just like when he was a child, but his figure seemed unnaturally still, like a statue. I came closer, and at that moment it seemed to me that he was not there at all. It was so strange that I froze in place. Something made me come even closer. I felt how the air became cold and the tension grew. His eyes, they were not blue as I was used to seeing, but light gray, almost glassy. They did not look real. His body stood in the same pose, but his gaze was empty, like someone who has not lived in this world for a long time. I did not know what to do. All my feelings, all my thoughts were mixed into one. I was next to something that seemed to be my friend, but in fact was something completely alien. I slowly backed away from the tree, and at that moment I felt his presence next to me. He was standing there, but his body seemed empty, like a shell that no longer had life in it. He might as well have been a creature, not a person. The feeling hit me instantly. I realized that this was more than just weirdness. Jason, my best friend, was someone or something else, and it seemed like I was the only one who noticed. But why was he still there? Why was he following me if he knew I understood? I didn't know what to do with this information. What was I supposed to do with this horrific discovery? That evening in the park left me completely confused. Time seemed to stand still, and I didn't know how to live with this knowledge. Jason, my best friend, was not him. And although I still couldn't figure out what exactly had happened to him, I felt like I shouldn't back down. But with each passing day, it became harder and harder to keep myself together. The next day at school, I decided to take action. I needed answers, to understand what had happened to Jason, and maybe learn how to get him back. But everyone around me was acting as usual. His classmates didn't notice any changes. Everyone saw him as the same Jason they had known before. It made me think that maybe I was the only one who noticed. Was it just me imagining things that had changed? Was I just dwelling on that thought? But no, something was wrong. I ran into him again in the hallway. He was walking toward me, his eyes cold, almost emotionless. He was so close it felt like he was watching my every move. I tried not to show my excitement, but my heart was pounding as if I was standing on the edge of a precipice, ready to step into the void. He smiled at me, but it was too forced, as if he was having trouble even faking it. I tried to answer him calmly, but that look didn't give me peace. After school, I met him at my locker. He was standing there, as always it seemed, just waiting. His gaze, his behavior. Everything was wrong. I felt myself being pulled towards him, like a magnet. But I couldn't go closer. I had to find out what happened, not stay silent. I was on the verge of asking him what happened, but something stopped me. He noticed my hesitation and suddenly spoke, although his words didn't sound like usual. It wasn't the ease that was there before. It was something I couldn't understand. I saw his face distort slightly, as if he was trying to portray an emotion he didn't feel. I realized that I couldn't trust him. His answer was alien. His reactions weren't sincere. But what should I do now? I couldn't leave it like this. I decided that I had to find out what happened to Jason, what happened to his eyes, to his behavior, to his presence. But how could I find the answer if every time I approached him, he became even more alien? I couldn't just watch this and ignore it. This wasn't my friend. This was something else. And I knew I had to investigate, even if it meant I risked losing everything I had. That night I went online, searching for everything I could. Mysterious disappearances, strange occurrences involving friends and loved ones. Anything that could explain the changes that had occurred to Jason. I didn't believe in the supernatural, but something inside me told me that this might be what I was experiencing. I found several articles that described strange cases of people whose personalities suddenly changed for no apparent reason. Some said that these people became empty, like shells, and only those who really knew them could notice. But most people simply couldn't tell the difference. I couldn't believe what I was reading, but deep down, I knew it could be true. Jason was different, and I was the only one who noticed. It wasn't just my imagination. The next day, when I saw him again at school, I knew I had to talk to him. I didn't know what to say, but I felt like it was time to figure it out. All day, I thought about how to approach him, how to ask for an explanation. But when the moment came and I approached him, something in his eyes made me stop. He didn't look like the usual Jason. His eyes were gray, cold, like a machine. And in that moment, I realized that everything I suspected was true. There was nothing alive, nothing human in his eyes. I couldn't wait any longer. I stepped towards him and said quietly, "You're not Jason." But he just smiled, his face still too intense, and there was nothing but emptiness in his eyes. I knew he wasn't going to admit what he knew. This was more than just a mask. This was a new person replacing the one I knew. I felt a pain squeeze inside me. I didn't know what to do. But one thing was clear. I couldn't just watch this anymore. I had to find out what happened to my friend and do whatever it took to bring him back, or at least find out who or what was taking his place now. Story 3. I got home late. It was already 1:36 a.m., and there was only one thought in my head. If only I could get to bed and sleep. The day had been long, tiring, and I felt the pressure in my head growing stronger. In the office, everyone was discussing the project, making noise, but I didn't care. I listened but didn't hear, mechanically succumbing to the rhythm of the working day. I had dinner with colleagues, but even dinner could not console me. It was just a necessity, like everything else that day. My apartment was on the third floor. Small, not very cozy, but quite comfortable for one person. I had long been accustomed to this place. It did not require effort, did not make you feel, it just was. I did not try to make this space more than just a place to sleep. I spent the evenings alone, preferring silence to noisy companies. This apartment always remained the same neutral, empty. I threw my bag on the counter, threw the keys on the shelf, and without thinking, walked towards the bedroom. And then I felt it, the silence that usually accompanies the night. But this time it was different. It was too thick, almost heavy. I froze. I felt uncomfortable in the silence, as if it were watching me, surrounding me somehow, too tightly. And then I realized that everything around me had become too audible. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, my own breathing, which had suddenly become loud, as if the air in the room was thick and there wasn't enough of it. I stood there feeling my pulse pounding in my ears and everything around me seemed to have shrunk. Nothing in the apartment had changed. It was the same room, the same things on the shelves, but now every sound seemed to be more than just a sound. It was a violation of the silence. I looked around, not knowing what to look for or what to pay attention to. Everything was quiet, but this feeling was strange, as if something that was usually hidden in the darkness was a little closer than it should be. The silence was broken when my phone vibrated. It was an unexpected, even frightening sound in such silence. I reached out and looked at the screen. A message from an unknown number. I knew I shouldn't answer it, but something stopped me. I lingered on the screen, not understanding why I felt such a strange alarm. "Hey, don't yell!" I felt an unpleasant tension growing inside me. This couldn't be a coincidence. It was too specific, as if someone knew something about me. I almost decided to ignore it, thinking that it was just some kind of prank or a mistake. But something about this message still alerted me. I put the phone down, but I couldn't continue my way to the bedroom. It was difficult to focus on simple things like usual, and I again paid attention to every little sound in the apartment. A few seconds later, the phone vibrated again. I squeezed it in my hands and opened a new message. There was a new phrase, even stranger. "Slowly put the phone down and don't turn around." My heart suddenly accelerated. The feeling that everything in the room had changed washed over me. The thought flashed through my mind that I was not alone, as if someone I couldn't see was nearby, watching my every move. I didn't know what to do. Every sense in my body was compressed into one point of fear. I needed to act, but I couldn't figure out how. I took a step back, not realizing that I was moving toward the kitchen. My legs were heavy and every step seemed difficult. I couldn't understand what was happening. Why was I suddenly so afraid of my own home? Why did it feel so alien here, so unwelcoming? As I crossed the threshold into the kitchen, I felt another strange sensation. The air became much denser. It pressed on my chest as if I was underwater. With each breath, it became more difficult to breathe. I slowly walked to the refrigerator. Everything in the apartment seemed abnormal. Too dark, too tight. The air inside was cold, even though I didn't even turn on the air conditioner. I looked at the phone screen again. Another message. My hands began to shake, but I opened it anyway. Reading those words made me feel like everything inside me froze. "I found your phone outside your apartment." I shuddered. How? My phone was in my hand. I looked back at the refrigerator, as if it might answer. Then, as if that wasn't enough, another message appeared. "The problem is, you're still inside." Something tightened in my chest. I felt my skin break out in a cold sweat. I stared at the screen, not believing my eyes, trying to figure out what was going on. Why did this man know where I was? Was this a prank, or was someone following me? Too many questions and no answers. And then, without warning, I felt the pressure on my chest get even stronger. I turned toward the door and, as if with some kind of premonition, stepped towards it. The door to my apartment looked normal, but as soon as I touched it, I felt something strange. It was warm, too warm, almost as if someone was standing on the other side, pressing their palm against the door. I froze, not knowing what to do. My body wouldn't listen to me, as if fear had completely paralyzed my muscles. Every instinct I had was screaming, Run away! But I stood there, pressed against the door, unable to move. The words from the messages flashed through my head again. You're still inside. But what did that mean? Who was sending this? Who was following me? And why was this all happening in my apartment? In my life, which seemed so normal, so ordinary. I forced myself to take a step back and looked at my phone again. New text. He's still there. I felt my insides go cold. Him. Who is he? My fingers tightened around the phone. I wanted to turn it off, throw it out the window, disappear. But I couldn't. I didn't know how to get rid of this feeling, how to escape what was in my head. I looked at the door again. Silence. Everything looked calm on the outside, but I knew it wasn't. I knew that somewhere, right behind it, something was watching. My steps were careful. I didn't dare breathe too loudly. It seemed like every sound I made could give me away. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to understand what was happening. But what could I understand in this nightmare? I went back to the peephole. Everything looked the same through it, dark and empty. But then I saw something strange. I froze. A pale, translucent light began to creep down the hallway, barely visible, but clearly coming from something on the outside of the door. My heart pounded even harder when I saw it. An eye, strangely huge as if it were too big for a human face. But it wasn't just an eye. It was something unimaginably alien and sinister. It was bloodshot, and I could see veins spreading out from beneath its surface, as if there was no boundary between the eye's tissue and its surroundings. Yellow fluid was flowing inside the eyeball. It wasn't just a tear or a furtive blink. It was something else, and the eye was alive. My gaze was fixed on it, and that was the worst part. Because the eye didn't blink, it moved. No, it didn't blink. It just shifted, as if looking at me from a different angle. It was strange and unnatural. And when that eye touched me with its gaze, I felt everything inside me tighten. I flinched as if its presence could break my reality. My breathing quickened, and my gaze remained fixed on the door, on this thing I couldn't understand. It clearly knew I was watching. And then, as if in response to my own confusion, another text came. He already knows you're here. It was like an electric shock. I couldn't understand what it meant. Why? Why was he watching me? And why had no one warned me about what was about to happen? This wasn't a prank, not a mistake. This was reality from which there was no escape. I tore my gaze away from the peephole and looked around the room. Suddenly, all these familiar objects began to seem alien. My apartment, my life. It all seemed to have changed. I couldn't stop thinking about what could be happening behind the door, in the dark emptiness. And in that moment, I realized I was not alone. Somewhere nearby, beyond my perception, something was next to me, and it was not going to leave. My hands started shaking again, but I still couldn't look away. I couldn't afford to take a step back. I was trapped in this nightmare, and in that moment I realized that if I didn't do something now, I wouldn't survive. That eye, that thing that was watching me, it wouldn't stop until I took my next step. I turned away from the door, but the room became even quieter. The silence swallowed me up. I felt something change in the air. It was thick, like a heavy blanket pressing on my chest. And then, when I was about to turn around and start moving towards the exit, I heard footsteps. Slow, measured steps, but the kind that made my heart stop. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but the fear was so strong that I couldn't move. The footsteps kept coming. They were getting closer. I stood in the hallway, unable to move. The silence around me was heavy, almost tangible, like an invisible mass pressing on my chest. The entire room I was in seemed somehow unnatural, as if something had disrupted my usual perception of space. It wasn't just silence, but an unsettling emptiness that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to move, but my legs felt like they were in armor. No way to step or turn. With every breath I took, the air became thicker, as if the entire apartment was filled with something invisible, but tangible. Every movement I made, every nerve in my body, literally screamed that something was wrong. I turned around, peering into the dark part of the corridor, which had been empty just recently, when I had just entered the apartment. Now this part of the apartment seemed alive, filled with some presence that I could not understand. And in this dark corner, something began to move. But it was not visible, had no outlines. It simply filled the space with its energy, as if the air itself in that place was distorted. I could not understand what it was, but a sharp, familiar fear immediately appeared in my chest. It paralyzed my entire body, depriving me of willpower and the ability to act rationally. I felt goosebumps crawling on my skin, and my heart was beating faster and faster, filling my thoughts with anxious and panicky thoughts. Suddenly, I turned my attention back to my phone. It was in my hand. The screen cracked, but it was still vibrating. I glanced at the screen. It was a signal, a message I hadn't expected. My head was ringing. Time seemed to slow down, and everything around me disappeared into this fear. My phone was my only link to reality, but at that moment, its messages felt like warnings, like footsteps in the same dark hallway I didn't dare look down. I realized that each message wasn't just text. It was like a guide, like a directive, leading me down a path I didn't want to take. My body was like a stone, frozen in fear. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to do, and this feeling of hopelessness was taking over me. The walls of the room seemed increasingly cramped, as if the apartment itself was shrinking, giving me neither air nor room to maneuver. The noise of footsteps did not stop, and with each new step, the dark shadows in the corner of the corridor became more distinct, more real. I tried to imagine what could be in that part of the apartment, but my mind refused to perceive the images that arose. It did not want to see what could not be real, and this frightened me even more. I couldn't understand what was happening. It seemed like I was trapped somewhere, with no way out. And with each passing moment, this situation became clearer and clearer. I wasn't alone in this apartment, and what surrounded me had nothing in common with the normal, familiar world. It was something I couldn't name, couldn't understand, but it was everywhere, in every particle of air, in every corner of the room. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I felt it struggling with all its might against the silence. I didn't know what to do. Run? No, I had no strength. I couldn't even move, as if an invisible force was holding me in place. Every breath I took became harder and harder. And it wasn't because I was scared. It was the heavy, indescribable air that was squeezing my chest, making me lose consciousness from fear. I needed to do something, but I didn't know what. The darkness in the hallway continued to grow, as if the shadows were swallowing up the light and the space around them. And then it was there, a presence. It was there, close by. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it coming closer. The footsteps kept coming, and each sound was becoming clearer. I knew I had to act, but I couldn't. My mind was clouded. My hands were uncontrollable. I tried to grab something that would help, but the only thing I could do was stand and wait. Wait for what was about to happen. And at that moment, when the shadows had almost completely covered the entire hallway, I heard a new sound. It was faint but distinct. A click, as if someone had quietly turned a doorknob. At that moment, I felt the world around me shrink. The space became dark and deafening, as if the apartment itself had swallowed up the light. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as if something invisible was pulling me in, holding me still, waiting for the next step. The door. The door in the hallway, which had seemed to be fixed, was now moving. Not just moving slightly, but turning, the lock clicking, as if someone from outside was trying to get in. I froze in place, clutching my phone, which was still vibrating in my hand, like a harbinger of something inevitable. Something had changed in the atmosphere. The air had become heavy, almost tangible, and I could feel every molecule of it pressing against my lungs. My heart was pounding in my chest, but there was no sound. Even my own pulse seemed distant, like an echo in an empty room. I stared into the dark hallway, unable to comprehend what was happening. I didn't know what I was expecting. My head was screaming at me to leave, to run, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey. I was like a zombie trapped in a trap, unable to move or protest. And so I stood there, motionless, waiting for the next thing to happen. A click. The door turned a little further, as if someone was slowly and carefully opening it. I felt my heart skip a beat, then squeeze again, dully in my chest. From somewhere in the dark corridor, I heard the sound of footsteps. They weren't normal footsteps, not human footsteps. They were something else, something incomprehensible, alien. The noise was jerky, with a kind of creaking sound, as if someone were moving on sand or snow. But the steps were too fast, too unnatural. My body remained frozen, as if I could not move. I tried to do something, to find a way to escape, but a feeling of complete powerlessness washed over me. Everything inside me resisted, but I could not change anything. I felt the cold penetrating my bones, the darkness filling every corner of the apartment, surrounding me. It was everywhere. And then finally I saw him. He was not a man. He was something else. He stood in the threshold, his figure barely distinguishable against the dark corridor, but I could see him. Tall, too tall to be human. He stood motionless, like a statue, and I realized that he was watching me. Every movement was slow, as if he were part of the shadow itself, part of the night. I instinctively recoiled, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature. Its figure was unnaturally elongated, and its skin seemed to be gray, covered in rough spots. Its head was tilted to the side, and I noticed that its eyes did not move. They were frozen, like mirrors reflecting emptiness. Then I understood. It was not alone. I could sense it without even looking in its direction. The monstrous figure was in the shadows, but I could not tear my eyes away from it. My body became heavy again, and my mind searched for a way out. I knew I had to run, but with each passing moment I felt it coming closer. Each movement it made was like a step towards my inevitable death. I screamed, but I did not hear my scream. It was as if it had swallowed up all the sounds around me, leaving only this whistling, dull breathing. It was approaching, and there was nothing I could do. My body was finally able to move. I rushed to the door, but I didn't make it. He was already there, so close that I could feel his presence on my skin. I turned around, but I couldn't see anything, just emptiness and cold. The phone vibrated again, and I almost dropped it. It was too much. I wasn't ready. I didn't have enough time. I didn't have enough strength. I tried to understand what this creature was, why it was here, but every time I thought I could find an answer, everything turned into a dark cloud again, into vague figures that wouldn't let me go. And then, when I was almost reaching the door, something even more terrible appeared in front of me. Its shadow eclipsed everything around me, and I realized that I couldn't escape. The force that held me was stronger than any fear. Too late. At that moment, I realized one thing. I was not alive. I was part of something that lived in the darkness. The world around me began to dim, as if the light was slowly disappearing, slipping through my fingers, leaving only shadows and emptiness. I couldn't breathe. The air seemed to be there, but it had become viscous, unnatural. I felt its heaviness, as if I didn't have enough room to breathe. Every inspiration was like a struggle with an invisible force that pressed down on me, constricting my chest. I looked at the figure standing in the dark corridor, but everything around it seemed to blur, disappearing into this strange emptiness. Its eyes did not move, but I knew that it was watching me, that it was always there, invisible and hidden in the shadows. I could not understand what this creature was, but it was clearly not alive, not ordinary. I felt its presence, dark and frightening, penetrating me. It did not move, but I knew that I could not escape it. Time seemed to slow down, and my whole life was compressed into one moment of fear and awareness. My legs became weak, and I could not stop the trembling that ran through my entire body. I took a step back, but its figure remained in place. I could not understand why I felt nothing but fear. It was like I was somewhere between reality and something terrible that should not exist in this world. I suddenly realized that I was on the brink of something far more terrifying than just meeting some creature. This was more. What it represented was not simply a threat. It was like being consumed, like being at the very center of some universe I could not understand. The phone in my hand vibrated again, but I didn't dare look at the screen. I knew it couldn't be a simple message. It wasn't just another notification. I felt its vibrations, like small waves of fear, penetrating my skin and making me shudder. I didn't want to look at the screen. I knew that what was there was not for me. I took a few steps back, but my legs suddenly froze. An almost invisible force held me, not allowing me to move. It was as if the ground beneath my feet was disappearing, and I, absorbed in this terrible state, could not find my way back. The darkness around me only intensified, as if I was plunging into this dark abyss. I felt myself being pulled towards this creature, as if its shadow, its energy was penetrating me. I tried to resist, tried not to look in its direction, but something gave me no choice. It was like an ominous magnet that attracts everything that yields to it. And I knew that if I looked at it, if I took another step, I would drown in this shadow forever. My thoughts became blurry, as if I had lost touch with reality. My body no longer obeyed me. I stood there, a frozen figure, waiting for the next thing to happen. I did not know what to do. All I could do was continue to look at this dark creature that was in front of me and wait for what I could not change. My fingers tightened around the phone, and I couldn't understand why I kept holding it. It was like an unnecessary reminder, something that tied me to this world, but I knew it wouldn't help. I didn't know what would help. I didn't know if there was anything that could save me. Meanwhile, the figure took a step forward. It wasn't a movement, but rather a stretching of space. It came to me not as a person, but as something that couldn't be understood. I felt it coming closer, and my life, like everything I knew, became empty and meaningless. Thoughts of escape, of finding a way out, flashed through my mind again, but I knew there was no way out. I was here, in this corridor, with this creature, and no move, no action would save me. I felt its shadow wrap around me, penetrating inside like something long forgotten and terrible that lives somewhere in the dark corners of human memory. I couldn't resist. I knew I was losing control, losing myself, losing everything I once had. Then the figure took another step, and this time it left no room for doubt. My phone fell from my hands and its vibration stopped, and with that disappearance, I felt myself disappearing too. The dark corridor sucked me into its abyss, and I couldn't get out. The silence was so thick I couldn't breathe. The air tightened around me like an invisible noose, and I didn't know how much time had passed since I lost the ability to move. It was as if I was locked in an invisible cage, and every moment, every intrusion into my thoughts felt like new, sticky layers of fear that were layered on top of each other, consuming me. I stood in the same place, not knowing what was happening around me. The walls of the apartment disappeared, and with them the sense of reality. The darkness in the hallway became alive, as if it was trying to soak into me, to dissolve all my thoughts and feelings in this unbearable empty space. It was as if my body was leaving me, and I was becoming part of this place, part of something bigger that had no explanation. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the dark figure standing before me. It didn't move, but I felt its presence on a physical level. Every glance it gave me penetrated me, and it felt like I was losing myself, dissolving in its eyes. Everything around me became foggy, as if reality itself was beginning to dissolve, shift, lose its shape. And then, at the moment when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when I began to be overwhelmed by the feeling that I was no longer a person, but just a shadow in this strange world, I felt it. It was there, standing right in front of me. And despite its silence, its presence became almost tangible, so dense that I could feel it, like a cold penetrating into the very essence. I couldn't break out of this state. My eyes couldn't tear themselves away from his empty yellow eyes that didn't blink, didn't move, but still looked at me, as if deeper than just a physical gaze. I felt his gaze penetrating me, trying to pull me into his dark abyss. My fear became so intense that I no longer felt my body. All I knew was that I stood in front of this creature, with no power or ability to change anything. I tried to break free, but only met invisible walls time after time. He stood here, and I was just his victim, his prisoner. And at that moment, something happened. I felt something change around me. It wasn't a normal change, like a room getting a little brighter or darker. It was more like that moment when consciousness begins to recede and something completely alien begins to seize your will. I felt its power penetrate me, and the understanding that I no longer controlled my thoughts or my body overwhelmed me with a suffocating feeling. I didn't remember when I stopped feeling fear. It wasn't the end, but I was no longer myself. I didn't know what was happening to me anymore. I couldn't trust my eyes, my feelings. This wasn't what was happening in the real world. This was something much more terrible and inexhaustible. And I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing. I was a part of it, and I couldn't get out. And then silence. A silence that was as terrifying as the first time I felt his presence. I found myself back in the dark corridor, but now everything was different. This was not the place I lived, nor the place I thought I would end up. Everything had been replaced, and I wasn't sure there were boundaries in this place at all. No movement, no sound. I stood there in nothing but emptiness, airless and cold. I tried to understand what had happened to me, but nothing was happening. No sign of life, no sign that I had ever been a living person. Everything was gone. I didn't know what to do, where to go, how to get out. But one thing was clear. I was already a part of this world. His world was now my world, and I couldn't free myself from this presence. The shadows were merging with my skin, and I was no longer sure that I was alive. My mind no longer searched for answers. All that was left was to stand and listen to the silence. Because perhaps in this world, silence was the most important reality. I turned my head and suddenly, without warning, a light flashed. But it was no ordinary light. It was a light that burst out of the void, just like the shadows and figures that moved around. Everything I had once known was now shattered, erased. I no longer knew what reality was, and I no longer knew what to do. The world I had entered was unbearably alien, and it had probably been waiting for me forever. Story 4. Tordidito Morning. I keep dreaming about a cemetery that doesn't exist. It's not a place I've been to before, not a cemetery I could remember from my travels. No, this cemetery is different. It's like it's pulled out of some other world, and yet I feel familiar. I can't figure out why, but every time I go there, I feel a strange calm. The cemetery is always dark, slightly foggy, but there's no fear in it. Rather, there's something strange and calming, as if I were in a place I should have visited long ago. 2 days ago, I had that dream again. I was walking down a familiar street in my grandmother's village. The sun was setting, and the road was lit by a soft light that made everything around me seem slightly ghostly. It was always quiet along this road, just the soft rustling of the trees and the occasional sound of people walking. But this time I was not alone. There was a girl walking next to me, tall with long orange hair, in a blue dress. I could not see her face clearly, although I was sure that I had met her before. She somehow knew me too well, as if we were close, although I did not remember her name or where I might meet her. We walked in silence, quiet steps, soft, as if this path was familiar to both of us. We passed the park, along a road lined with tall trees with drooping branches, and finally found ourselves in front of the cemetery. It stood in the distance, surrounded by stone walls that were slightly taller than I was. On the walls I noticed some old engravings, like the ones I had seen on old books. They were blurry, as if they had long since been weathered by time. "Come in," the girl said, without turning her head towards me. I did not feel fear, only a strange confidence. Everything was somehow familiar, and although I had never seen this place, I felt like I had been here before. I could not understand why. We walked through the stone gates and into a simple yet beautiful landscape. Old tombstones covered in moss lined the alley, like monuments to people long gone. They were worn, weathered over the years, but there was a special silence about them, a kind of reverence they held for those who rested there. There was no fear, only a silence in which every step became part of something inevitable. I stopped, and my gaze automatically fell on one of the tombstones. The name on it was faded in color, almost invisible, but I still tried to make it out. No matter how much I looked, the name remained blurred. "You shouldn't worry," the girl said. She stood there motionless, and I noticed that her voice was not strange, but on the contrary, soothing. As if she knew all this time how I felt. I turned to say something, but I couldn't find the words. I was just calm. For some reason, everything that was happening felt right, natural. I felt like I was there for a reason, but I still couldn't figure out what that meant. When I looked back, the girl had already disappeared. There was only a slight haze in the place where she had stood, as if her presence was part of the atmosphere itself. I didn't run after her, didn't look for her. I just stood there, knowing that I didn't have to do anything. Everything in this place was as it should be. That was when I woke up. I was lying in my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. It had been a dream, but it was so vivid, so real, that I couldn't separate it from reality. Even the smell of earth and old stones that I had smelled in the dream still hung in the air. For several minutes, I tried to understand what it was. Why did this cemetery seem so familiar to me? Why did this girl seem so familiar to me? But in the end, I decided not to dwell on it. It was just a dream. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe there were too many thoughts in my head. But for some reason, I couldn't get the dream out of my head. It lingered in my mind like a ghost, silently following me. And even now, as I sat at breakfast, I kept thinking about it. It was strange, but I didn't think there should be anything important in it. Just a strange dream. Nothing more. But 2 days later, as I sat in the office eating lunch, it occurred to me that this cemetery was not just a fantasy. It was real, familiar. I couldn't remember where I knew it from, but it was as clear as if I had seen it with my own eyes. 2 days later, the thought of the cemetery wouldn't leave me. It was strange. I couldn't understand why I was so sure that this place really existed. The dream was so vivid that it seemed that every memory of it was fixed in my memory, like a trace in the sand that couldn't be erased. And the more I tried to forget about it, the more I felt that this cemetery wasn't just a figment of my mind. It was real. I was almost sure of it. I thought about it every day, worried about it, tormented myself with questions. Where is this cemetery? When was I there? Why does it feel so familiar? Only vague memories swirled in my head, like fragments of the past, which were not enough to put together a complete picture. Maybe it was just a memory that I lost in childhood. I decided that it would be best to visit my grandmother in the village to calm myself down. After all, if this place really existed, I should remember it. I was going to go, just in case, to check. Maybe something would help me understand why this dream affected me so strongly. After packing my bag, I got into the car. The drive took 2 hours, but I drove as if time didn't matter to me. There were too many thoughts in my head that didn't give me peace. I wanted answers, but I didn't know what questions to ask. This cemetery, these old tombstones, it was all like a piece of a missing puzzle that I couldn't put together. It was already dark when I arrived in the village. Only dim lights stretched along the road, and everything around seemed darkened. Grandma's house was cozy, it smelled of cookies and tea, and her greeting always calmed me. I didn't tell her why I had come. It would have been too strange to say that I had come because of a dream. It would have been ridiculous. That night after I went to bed, the dream came again. It was almost the same as the first time. The same road, the same park, but now I saw the girl's face. She was standing next to me, and I couldn't understand why she seemed so familiar to me. I remembered her eyes, bright blue, almost like the sky at dawn. I remembered her hair, bright like orange lights that seemed to glow in the darkness, and that scar on her nose, small, barely noticeable, but it was there. She looked at me, and there was a strange confidence in her gaze, as if she knew me much better than I knew myself. And yet I knew nothing about her. I couldn't remember her name. I didn't know where I could have known her from, but her face remained in my memory as something I definitely had to remember. In the morning, as soon as I woke up, I felt a restlessness that did not give me peace. I got out of bed and went downstairs. Grandma had already made breakfast, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the room. I tried to hide my anxiety, but something inside me was wrong. I couldn't figure out what it was, but something was pulling me there, to that place from my dreams. I wanted to go there, the cemetery. I didn't tell my grandmother why I had decided to go. I only said that I wanted to visit my grandfather's grave. It was a common excuse, and my grandmother didn't suspect anything strange. She agreed with a smile. As I sipped my coffee, slowly swallowing each cup, I felt everything inside me growing, a feeling I couldn't ignore. When I went outside, everything seemed so familiar. The road I was walking along was exactly the same as in my dream. I already knew what was waiting for me ahead, and everything looked as it should have been. The park, the trees, the houses, everything was in its place, as if this path hadn't changed for decades. I walked without stopping, but at some point I realized that I needed to find a cemetery. I reached the place where it should have been, but instead of stone walls and old graves, I saw only a forest. It was thick, dark, and this feeling of emptiness and delusion overwhelmed me. I kept walking, trying to find traces of the cemetery, but there was nothing. I was already starting to doubt that I had come to the right place when I suddenly saw an old friend, Henry. We used to study together, but had not spoken for a long time. He looked back at me but did not recognize me right away. I called him, and despite the strange meeting, we started talking. He offered to show me the cemetery, and I agreed without hesitation. When we got to this place, I felt as if I had finally found what I was looking for. But this place was alien to me. It was not the cemetery I saw in my dreams. It was not the cemetery with which I was so closely connected. The next morning, after I returned to my grandmother's house, I sat at the table and tried to figure out what had happened. The dream, the visit to the cemetery, the strange feelings that did not leave me. All this became something more than just memories. What if all this is really connected to my past? But why do I not remember anything? In the morning, I had a hard time dealing with the fact that I had not found the place in the cemetery that I had seen in my dreams. Henry seemed not to notice. He led me in the other direction, to the old graves, but they were not as I remembered. I saw other tombstones, other names, all alien and unfamiliar. This was not the place. I did not know what to do with this discovery. I walked home, trying to somehow calm myself down. Many questions were spinning in my head, but there were no answers. In the evening, my grandmother brought a photo album. She always loved to remember the past, to look at old photographs, but I already felt that this would not be just a pleasant walk through memory, but something more. I took the album and began to turn the pages, looking at the images of my childhood. This whole familiar scene to me, the faces of relatives, friends, bright moments, everything as always. And then suddenly one photo caught my attention. In it, I and some girl, red hair, pale face. I didn't recognize this face. I stared at the image in surprise, not understanding who it was. I asked my grandmother who the girl was. She laughed, claiming that she was my best friend when I was little, Juliana. "You don't remember her?" she asked with a smile. I felt something inside me clench. I didn't remember Juliana. I didn't remember her, even though my grandmother claimed that we were inseparable. When I told my grandmother that I didn't remember the girl, she looked a little surprised. There was a look of confusion in her eyes, but she didn't press the issue. She just continued the conversation as if it was normal that I didn't remember anything. She didn't understand that it bothered me, but I knew something was wrong. I felt anxiety growing in my chest. Later, sitting with my grandmother and listening to her stories about my childhood, I looked at the photograph again. I tried to remember, but nothing came. That's when I decided that I had to figure this out. I had to figure out who this Juliana was and why I didn't remember her. I couldn't just leave it like that. Unable to sit still any longer, I decided to go for a walk to calm down. The thought of Juliana kept spinning around in my head. Why didn't I remember anything about her? Why did that face I saw in the photograph seem so familiar, yet so foreign? Like it was a part of my life that for some reason I shouldn't forget. I walked to the park just to clear my head, to try to get rid of these unsettling thoughts. There were some teenagers sitting on a bench, and one of them recognized me immediately. He said that my grandmother was Susan and that he knew me from his sister's stories. He mentioned a name that immediately came to mind, Juliana. He said that she was his sister. I froze. All the memories came rushing back at once, but something was wrong. I didn't know what to do. I asked where she was. He said she was here, in the village, and that everyone knew her. But how could it be that I didn't remember anything? Juliana? Was it her? The girl with the red hair I didn't know? I felt panic rising. I couldn't believe what I had just heard. I quickly said goodbye to the teenagers and went home. I didn't know what to do next. I had to do something with this knowledge. But I didn't find my grandmother in the house. She had gone into the garden, tending to the flowers, and I felt better. I stayed in the house alone, picked up the photo album, and returned to that very photo. I looked at Juliana's face, trying to understand what was happening. And then I felt that chill in my stomach again. The face in the photograph changed again. It became blurry. Just like before, when I saw this photograph for the first time, I was terrified. I couldn't understand what was happening. Why was it disappearing? It was strange. I felt that chill in my chest again, and something inside me snapped. I didn't know anymore if it was paranoia or just a mind game. But I knew one thing. Something was wrong with this place, with this girl, with my memory. Everything was going crazy, and I didn't know what to do with this fear. I ran outside and shouted to my grandmother, but she didn't hear me. I walked back home, feeling that something dark and scary was lurking somewhere nearby. Night came again, and I couldn't escape this worry. My thoughts kept returning to Julian. Who was she? Why didn't I remember her? Why was my grandmother so calm when I asked her questions, not noticing that something didn't add up? It was like a vicious circle. The more I tried to figure it out, the more questions arose. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling the darkness closing in on me. I became more and more unsure of myself with each passing minute. Nothing seemed real. The dreams, the photographs, meeting Henry, talking to the teenagers in the park. None of it fit together in my head. All the details seemed to fall apart, and I kept piecing them together, trying to find some kind of explanation. My mind was getting more and more lost in conjecture, trying to connect these fragments that did not fit together. What if it was all just a coincidence? What if I just made up this girl in the cemetery? But every morning when I woke up, I felt that this world of dreams and reality were intertwined. I could no longer distinguish one from the other. Waking up early in the morning, I got out of bed and, without realizing what I was doing, went outside. I did not want to wake my grandmother. I needed to walk, to at least get rid of this feeling of anxiety that did not leave me. I walked along a familiar street, mentally returning to what had happened in the last few days. The area had not changed. Everything was as always. The same houses, the same road, the same trees. But inside I had a feeling that I was standing on the brink of something incomprehensible. I walked towards the park where it all began. My steps were slow, hesitant. My mind was spinning with memories that refused to form a logical picture. I thought about Julianne, about the photograph, about how her face blurred when I looked at it. Every memory now seemed unreliable, as if I was in the hands of someone who controlled my thoughts. When I got to the park, a strange feeling came over me. I looked around and saw the same teenager who had talked about his sister. He was sitting on a bench with his friends again. I didn't know what to do, but I walked up to him. He noticed me, smiled, and invited me to sit next to him. I didn't know what to look for, what to ask. I was confused, but I couldn't resist the desire to know more. We started talking. I asked about Juliana, who she really was, why everything was so strange. But his answer was the same as before. She was his sister, just an ordinary girl from the village. I couldn't understand what was going on. He said that she had lived here all her life, but there was something about his words that didn't sit well with me. He was too calm, and I felt like he was hiding something from me. As I walked home, I felt like someone was watching me. It was a strange feeling, as if every step, every glance was being monitored. I slowed down and looked around, but saw nothing. This feeling did not leave me the whole way, as if someone had been watching me since the moment I arrived in this village. When I returned to the house, my grandmother was still in the garden. I went into the room and picked up the photo album again. I again noticed the picture that had been troubling me so much. Each time I looked at the photo, I felt more and more uncomfortable. Juliana's face kept changing, and this was not a coincidence. I was beginning to understand that all this was not just a trick of the mind. Something in this village, in these people, did not add up. Something hidden in the past, and I cannot shake the feeling that I am missing something. Something that I should have understood a long time ago. That night I did not sleep. Fragments of memories were spinning in my head again, fragments of events that could not fit together. I tried to put everything together into a single picture, but it seemed impossible. In the morning, I decided that I would return to the cemetery. I had to find answers, see this place again. Something made me think that I would find something important there. As I was about to leave, my grandmother began talking again about my old friends, the ones I knew as a child. But I could not listen to her. I was fixated on one thing, on Juliana, on this place, on this village. I felt that something dark was hiding behind this place, and I had to find out what it was. With each step towards the cemetery, I felt the tension growing. I almost felt the breath of something incomprehensible nearby, as if I was on the verge of a discovery, but I did not know if I was ready for it. I returned to the cemetery that same day, once I realized that I needed to figure out what was happening. This place was haunting me, and I knew that maybe this was the only place I could find answers. There was no logical explanation for what was happening in my head. The dream, the photos, Juliana. All these fragments did not fit together, but I could not shake the feeling that they were somehow connected. Something important was hiding in this place. I walked along a familiar path, passing trees that became more threatening with every step. Their shadows fell on the ground, as if trying to hide my tracks. And although I was sure that I had come to the right place, deep down I doubted that this cemetery really existed. Perhaps it was just a hallucination, the fruit of my fatigue or stress. As I approached the exact spot where the fence should have been, I felt the strange feeling again. There was nothing. No graves, no stone walls, no trees like the cemetery in my dream. I was standing in an empty forest. The place was dark and cold, and its silence was pressing down on me. I looked around, not understanding what was happening. It seemed to me that I had seen this place before, but there was nothing where I expected to find a cemetery. I felt something growing inside me, a feeling of anxiety, fear, but also curiosity. I took a few steps deeper, trying to understand what had happened to this place. I knew I was supposed to be here, that I had to find an answer, but something was holding me back from going further. I didn't know what, something dark and alien. Suddenly I heard a noise, a rustling sound, like someone was walking behind me. I turned around, but there was no one there. Just the same trees, the same dark forest that stretched out around me. I kept walking, step by step, as if my feet were moving on their own, without my mind telling me to. I came to a small area where there were several old headstones. They were covered in moss and time, their graves worn away, like everything else associated with this place. But on one of them I noticed something unusual. A name. It was a name I knew. Mandy. It was etched right into the stone, and next to it was the name Emma. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt like it was important. All those names. They were familiar to me, but I didn't know where they came from. I stood there staring at those tombstones, and in that moment I felt something trying to get a hold of me again. A cold wind running across my skin. I turned around and saw a familiar figure. It was her, the girl with the orange hair, but her face was blurry again, as if she didn't exist. I didn't know what it meant, but I felt like she was a part of this place. She was standing there looking at me, but she wasn't speaking. I didn't know what to do. All my thoughts were jumbled, and I was sure I was on the brink of something important, but I didn't know what. I tried to remember everything I knew about her, about Juliana. Her face was blurring and disappearing into a cloud of fog, as if she was a part of this village, a part of my memories, but she wasn't real. I stepped forward, but she was gone, as if she had never been there. I looked around, and I was alone again among the graves in this dark forest. Suddenly, everything became clear. This girl was not just part of my dream. She was connected to this place, to this cemetery. She was part of what I was trying to forget. In all these years, I had tried not to remember her, but now she was back again, to help me understand what had happened. I stood there looking at the empty graves and wondered, what did it all mean? Why could I still not understand what was happening here? Why could I still not remember my connection to this place, to this cemetery, to this girl? The answers I had been looking for were still hidden, and all I could do was go back and try to figure it out again.